I have been coming into a state of trying to wrap up this project I started 18 months ago when COVID hit, and try to figure out what does it all mean and what am I supposed to do next. And what's funny is that in some ways, like the greatest achievement for me is the fact that I can throw up a meeting on a random bizarre topic of interest to me and have a number of people willing to show up and be part of that conversation, which is really quite extraordinary and gratifying, because these are things that have been bothering me at various levels and I was never quite sure how to process it. So thank you.
Is this related at all to our conversation yesterday?
This has been sort of many different streams have been feeding into this conversation.
Okay.
So in particular, one of the triggers for this was our friend Anonymous in the center of the screen here.
Thank you.
A question about emotions and is there such a thing as too much and how does that all fit together? And I've been thinking about this for a while. I said, okay, this is a good excuse to force me to put them into a coherent form that I can explain to people. If my dogs will quiet enough that I can hear myself talk. Let me try switching to a headphone.
Give them a bone.
Yeah.
Okay, hopefully that's a little less background noise.
Spike it with some tequila.
So, I thought about that. Usually we do the communion at the end, but I'll try this one sober, see if it's better or worse that way. Okay, so let me just go ahead and start with the slides and we will go from there.
Do we want to pray first?
You are welcome to. This wasn't intended to be a spiritual meeting, but I will take all the prayer I can get. You want to go for it, Emiliana?
Sure. Lord, grant us wisdom and favor, insight and foresight, revelation and discernment, and let it be to your glory. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. So one of the things I'm trying is to figure out how to talk about spirituality in a neutral way to describe the problem, rather than from within a given religious context. And this is inspired by my friends over at the Minerva Project. So I think of this sort of like it wasn't the thesis defense, it was the thesis pitch that I did, where you say, this is the problem that I want to solve and how I'm going to go about solving it. And I don't know if that's entirely the right metaphor, but it's where I'm starting from. So I decided, wrestling with this thing that I've been trying to get in my head, the best way I could describe it is trying to solve the problem of being human and try to explain it in a way that well, there's a few things here. Like the first question is, can you even understand what I'm saying? Which is not always a given, especially when I'm at the edge of my own thought processes. Secondly, if you can understand it, does it actually make sense? Does it fit in with the things that you understand about the world, and you can kind of see how it fits in there? And then if it does make sense, which parts of it ring true? I don't know if all of it's going to ring true or if any of it will, but and then the last is what triggers you? It's like, I can't believe he said that, or that really bugs me. And those are all interesting things. You can just think these things to yourself. You can, just ask me directly, or you can put it in the chat if you want to just spur discussion in the back channel while I'm going through it. Any questions before we dive into the content?
Just a process question. Would you
Sure.
prefer that you be allowed to finish the whole thing, or a slide, or interruptions at any time? Like, how would you want this to proceed?
Excellent question. I think I would, the optimal route for me is I'll put up a slide, I'll explain what I mean, and then I'll open it up for discussion. We have about 6 slides, so we can do about 10 minutes each, and then we will go. But if something really bugs you and you feel the need to blurt it out, that's useful information too. All right, so I'll start with where I started, which was an observation, is that I've been reflecting on different conflicts I've had, some involving many of you, some of them recorded online. And I noticed that the worst decisions come when I feel like I'm reacting to my internal tensions and the narratives that are going on in my head. And I think it's the external reality that I have to do something about. And not being able to hold that tension long enough to respond wisely is when I find myself making bad decisions and when I perceive others making decisions that I find suboptimal. This idea of tension and not being willing to dwell in the tension is what I've identified as what I think is the core problem in bad decisions or unhealthy behaviors. So that's the first slide. Any thoughts, comments, questions, notices, likes, or wonders?
Ernie, you probably should define what's reacting, what's responding.
I could do that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, so a reaction is without thought. You just do it. It's like whenever somebody says something, instead of thinking it through before you say, open your mouth, you just, responding is thinking it through before you say anything, going through all your filters and thinking about what you're going to say. Is it tactful? Is it diplomatic? Is it even, should I even bother saying it? What will be my posture, my emotion, blah, blah, blah. Reacting doesn't have any forethought. Response does. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
That's really good. Although one thing I would say is that I probably see them as more of a continuum. Like I'll notice sometimes that I think I'm being really logical and clear and deliberate. And then I'll look back later and say, oh crap, that was just totally rationalizing some deep prejudice I was feeling. And so there's different layers between that, but that's part of the challenge.
Could you elaborate on that last point, disguised as external reality?
So the one of the things that I have come to believe is that I can only really react to what is in my head, which has a stronger or weaker connection to what is going on in the world. But when I am in a place of threat, I ignore that distinction and assume that what's going on in my head is what's happening in the outside world.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Excellent questions.
As an example of that, Ernie, in your head, how are you defining evil?
I'm just throwing it out there as a provocative term, but it basically is, so I'm not defining it here. I'm just kind of using it as a signpost.
Okay, because I don't, evil comes from fleeing tension. Especially given the circumstances we as a nation are facing, they're not fleeing tension, they're going straight for it. So I'm not sure that that's even.
That is a great question to hold and see if I answer in the next 4 slides.
Okay.
Yeah, it is not an obvious statement at all. We'll see if it is obvious by the end of it or not.
I guess I'm just asking because evil comes from fleeing tension. If you don't have an idea of what you mean by evil specifically in this moment, then that statement feels a little bit like you needed a title to put over the bit that you were really interested in, which is the bit below it. And so you just thought of something that sounded provocative in order to make the statement underneath make sense.
That is entirely possible. A more generous interpretation, and probably accurate, a more generous, if less accurate interpretation is that I'm trying to solve the problem of where evil comes from.
But then
I thought we knew where evil came from.
Well, let's find out. Did
Okay.
they come out to the same thing or not? Let's see. All right, moving on. All right. next statement, the tension comes from core desire. So the idea is that, okay, there's this idea that tension here, this is kind of the fundamental concept I'm working with. And the other thing I've come to believe is that tension is not an artifact. It's part of the fundamental paradox of being human. This tension between connecting and individuating. My friend Tej and I were talking about early childhood development and this idea of the first 2 years, you kind of learn to connect, and the next 2 years you learn to individuate, and the rest of it is, in some sense, I've come to believe that everything else is sort of an interplay between those two things. All of the other conflicts and tensions we have come down to that. And as I've just been observing my own life the last few weeks, I've been just really struck by how I feel this desire to connect and then this desire to individuate, and that leads me to all sorts of high friction behaviors. And to me, this feels like, my thesis is basically, this is at the root of this tension we feel, which is something is not easy to solve just by changing our external circumstances.
By individuating, is that a fancy pants word for being solo?
No, it's very different, because the idea of it's being an individual. So it's, and particularly being an individual in the context of a community.
Okay.
Right. So if you have no community, it's easy to be an individual. It's much harder to be an individual if you're in a culture. And
Yeah.
if you're in a culture you don't feel like you conform to the median personality, it's even harder.
Okay.
Although arguably, if you do conform to the median, it's even harder still to be an individual. And it's a bit of a clunky word, but I couldn't find a better one. Any likes, wonders, or notices?
I actually kind of like the word. It speaks to both what, like a 2-year-old goes through, as you were saying, in early childhood in development, establishing themselves as, different from their mother and their family, but also like what teens go through, and also what a lot of people go through career-wise. They're, trying to establish themselves. I just see it as a lifelong sort of tension or thing anyway.
Right, and yeah, and the other phrase that I've been using a lot lately is self-differentiation. But even I wasn't quite sure what I meant by that. So I like this idea of the tension between connecting and individuating as a bit more practical way of talking about that. All right, moving on.
1 second, Ernie.
Oh yeah,
1 second.
sure.
1 second. Is it possible to be an individual and still connect?
That is an excellent question.
Exclusive?
That is an excellent question, my father. And I think the answer is to some extent.
It depends upon the group.
And the person.
Right.
Yeah.
And many other things. Right, yeah, because some places it's easy, or at least, and some places it's hard. And it varies. And what's interesting is that the tighter the group, I would argue the greater maturity it requires in order to be able to be an individual. Like if you're a solo, explorer in the middle of the woods with no ties anywhere, it's easy to be an individual. If you're a member of a highly regimented society or organization, it's much harder to be an individual.
Or a marriage.
Hello.
I'm not going to go there yet. We'll see if I get there before the end of the call. All right.
So, sorry, is your thesis therefore then that the core tension at the heart of everything is this connecting versus individuating, as opposed to the whole thing is about tension?
I would say that the core desires in our humanity are this connecting and individuating, and that all tensions spring from ramifications of those two. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
So is that where you think we get the tensions between God being just and God being merciful? And wanting to connect with God, but then also wanting to run away is obviously connected to that in some way. And then the whole, I do what I don't want to do and I don't do what I do want to do is all linked into it as well.
Yes is the short answer. The slightly longer answer is, from this point in this deck, I'm focusing more on these psychological questions and less on the theological questions.
Too.
Yes. So I'm going to try and address the psychological questions, and we'll see how much light that sheds on the theological ones.
Okay. I will save my psychological tensions for the end then.
Oh,
Can I go on? You'll have to live with the tension until then.
As long as we can connect over it, then it's fine.
That's good. Anything else on this slide? Can I move on?
please.
All right. So the interesting thing, and this was a conversation I was having with our friend Robbie, who's been into a temperaments kick in the last month or two. And it occurred to me that these classical idea of temperaments fits into this idea of the tensions. So some of you may be familiar with the four temperaments: phlegmatic, choleric, sanguine, melancholy, that classical Greek, I think, and they came into the Christian community in the 1980s.
Is this called Briggs-Meyer? Is it called
Myers-Briggs is something else.
Oh, okay, all right.
That's ENTJ, INFP kind of things, but I have not gone there yet. I may later. But the interesting thing is that I was thinking about, okay, when you have this tension between being an individual and connecting, the ways that you can resolve that are by giving up one side of that. And so the martyr de-individuates the self, the boss de-individuate others, the artist disconnects from others, and the performer, this was a surprise to me, but it seemed to work, disconnects from self. And so this is the idea that in order to help us manage that tension, we'll adopt a role where we focus or defocus on certain aspects of that tension. And in particular, in this framing, this is talking about the roles we use to deal with a specific problem. Temperament usually talks about it as being sort of a stable feature of your personality. And I'll talk about that in the next slide. But the idea is that these idea of roles is one of these key concepts as the mechanism we use to manage tension.
You think of it as sort of a shorthand?
I think of it as a shorthand for what?
Well, like if I know someone is in a role, both psychological and social expectations are, immediately formed.
Yes, I think that's the case. I mean, canonically, you could think of this as sort of the 1950s culture where the dad's the boss, the mom's the martyr, the son is the shallow performer, and the daughter's the deep artist. Nowadays, we're much more fluid and flexible in those roles. But it does seem like these are things that have a lot of cultural baggage, but also have some functional usage which may be transcendent between cultures.
How does it relieve tension?
So when I'm the boss, so let me talk about an example. Like when I'm dealing with my kids and I'm trying to get them out the door, I shift into boss mode where I don't care what they want, what they feel, what's going on in their heads. I want to get them out the door. And so when I'm in that role, I can give myself a pass for ignoring their individuality because of the thing I'm trying to accomplish. Whereas when I'm in nurturing dad mode, when I take him out for ice cream or coffee or milkshakes, I go into martyr mode where I am not stressing about what I need to get done. I'm just being emotionally present for them. And I don't know if this is a general thing, but like in computer science, we would call it a mode, right? Where certain parameters are visible and acted upon and other variables are suppressed. You hide those parts of the interface that don't matter right now.
So do we see it more as one person goes into each of those modes depending on the situation? Or is it that we have certain modes that, due to our situation and our experiences, we're more comfortable or we're more used to being?
And you are anticipating my next slide. So hold that thought.
Sorry.
Any other comment? No, this is good. It means I may actually have a logical progression in what I'm writing, which is extraordinarily comforting. Any other comments on this slide before I try to answer Anonymous's question? No? Okay. So this gets into this idea of personality. And this is a framework I got from my therapist, is that the concept of style and disorder has been around for a while in psychology, but he gave me a 3-level view, which I liked. Is usually when we talk about temperaments, we assert that people have a personality type, meaning that that's their default way of doing things. For him, that's the middle level. Is that the weaker version of that is we have a style, which is that more often than not, we'll tend to use that way of relating, but it implies we're adaptive about it. If it's not appropriate about it, we will choose a different role to inhabit. And it's something that we sort of have control over. At the other extreme is the idea of a personality disorder, where we will inhabit that role regardless of its consequences for the outside world. And we're almost addicted to it. We almost lack the ability to choose to inhabit a different role. And so there's sort of a continuum here, but these are 3 signposts along that status. And that's where the idea of personality and temperament intersects with this idea of roles. Did that answer your question?
Yes. Oh, I like that.
Thank you. Any others likes, notices, or wonders?
So I also noticed that when you say adaptive for 1A, that suggests that each type does have certain like benefits to it.
Right. The idea is that every role has a utility where it's helpful for resolving both internal and external tensions. Some of them may be, depending on your environment, some of those things can be quite common. Some of those things can be quite rare. And, you know, sliding on ahead, the idea of wisdom is you find the right role for the right situation.
So what's the benefit of the artist role?
Okay, so let's,
Please tell me, because my son just declared his major yesterday, and it's not psychology.
all right. So this is a good chance for, if no one minds, to jump to this is the big eye chart slide. And some of you have seen this before, where I call it the I feel tower, one of my favorite puns of all time. And the idea is that what we call an emotion is sort of an internal signal from our subconscious that is pushing us to inhabit a certain role. And the idea is that if we find the right role, then we adjust both our internal environment and our external situation to resolve that signal. You know, Ross will recognize this as signal handlers or interrupt handlers, right? There's interrupts that surface, and a lot of them, frankly, get resolved subconsciously without us even thinking about it. One author calls them micro emotions. But if it's not obvious what the right handler is, or the action takes a long time to perform, then it surfaces into a feeling or a mood or eventually a disorder. And the idea is that each of these things are an appropriate response in certain circumstances. So what's interesting for me, like I tend to have, and again, I'm not, like I keep tweaking this thing all the time. This is not meant to be definitive. This is sort of suggestive as one way of thinking about it. The thing I like about this is a couple of things. This was based on a feeling wheel that I turned into a feeling cube, or a feeling grid if you want to be technical. And it has opposites at opposite corners. So anger and fear, joy and grief, drive and wonder, disgust and shame. And those are nice pairings that kind of worked for me and drew on some of the things I've seen other people use. But the delightful bit is this fit into the 9 steps of the Enneagram, which has 9 personality types, except I split them up into oppositions and put 9 in the middle. And what's interesting to me is that I find, like, I tend to operate in drive mode, as most of you know who've had the misfortune of working on a project with me. And so shifting from that into wonder mode is where I can let myself be more artistic. A lot of my writings and music and things like that are where, like, I disconnect from the world. I don't care what anybody else thinks or wants from me. I don't care if I get anything done. I just want to feel. I just want to observe what's happening either internally or externally. And that for me is the value of the artist mode or artist role. And for me, actually alternating between drive and wonder, achiever and observer is how I reconcile a lot of the tensions in my life.
So does that mean that if I'm a 9, I'm already perfect, so I don't need to change anything?
Well, the interesting thing about 9 is that,
I like Christing.
so again, for me, that's a role, right? It's not your personality. It's not like who you
Oh.
are. It's what you do. And it's like, if you like to sit at 9, that's good. It's important to think through, you know, a lot of what people think of as a 9 is really a 2 martyr, right? In some ways. And if you are a joyful 9, you know, then it's worth thinking about. Like, if you really, I think the funny thing for me about the 9 is it is the point of maximum stress and maximum peace. And that to me is what I call Christing. It's entering into a situation, absorbing all the stress of everyone in the situation, and then having a cathartic act that turns it into peace for you and everyone else.
Okay, stop right there. So I'm an empath. I kid you not. I walk into a room and I can take the temperature without even thinking. I've been like this. I'm figuring out that I've been like this all my life. It's gotten me into a lot of trouble. And I just absorb the emotion or the tension or whatever of the room. And these days, I have figured out how to get from to, you know, to regulating myself and just be an observer. So, I mean, don't all of us have some of that to a certain extent?
Well, yeah, my point is that these are roles. These are not personality types. In different contexts, we can inhabit each of these. But, you know, depending on where we are on the scale, we may get stuck in one corner or another, right? Like, you know, I've had periods of time, you know, my father may have memories of this, where I was kind of stuck in anger type, and where they had worries about anger disorders or emotional disorders.
Or just disorder.
Or just disorder, yes. And so the idea is that what's interesting to me about this grid, I was going to say, oh, I'm feeling a lot of anger right now. Maybe I should stop and ask, what is the complementary thing I might be afraid of that's driving that anger? Or vice versa when I look at other people. And, you know, or, you know, conversely, it's like, well, I feel like I have a right to be angry, but then realizing I'm probably driving other people into a state of fear and being more mindful of that. So those are some of the ideas here. But for me, the big thing is that the emotions I'm feeling, the way to resolve them is by finding the right role. And using this grid might be, again, this is something I just threw together in the last couple of days. It's not rigorous or scientific. If I actually make this a thesis, I can imagine actually going into a research project to try and validate these, or, you know, define some rigor around it. But this is the mental framework I am currently playing with.
Question about giver, grief, and martyr. Okay, so these aren't personalities, but these are states of mind.
Yeah, mindsets or roles or mental frames. And the names at the top are pulled from the Enneagram.
I don't know what that is, but okay.
It's a personality assessment type, which again, I am reinterpreting as a mode of being. Yeah, mindset. Mindset's a fine synonym that we can inhabit.
So I'm fascinated about your use of the Enneagram numbers and the description afterwards, because I'm trying to work out why 7 and 4 and sort of 9 use the positive in health descriptors of the Enneagram, but all of the others use the in unhealth tendencies.
Interesting. Probably,
wait,
short
the
answer
other-
is that I'm not that sophisticated in Enneagram, so I just randomly grabbed ones that felt good. There may be some interesting psychological inferences you can draw from my choice of using them. Or it may just be random chance what I saw first and what I was feeling at that particular moment.
And most of these come from your experiences working with other people, right? Like you personally, you like recognize with most of these words.
No, I resonate. Well, so the way I do this, in case you're curious, is I like started with this I feel tower I built with the 9 emotions. And then I tried to, and I figured out, well, some of these map really nicely onto the de-individuate, disconnect thing. So I put them in there, and some of them didn't. I shuffled them around until I got something that kind of worked. And then I said, okay, well, let me see if I can stretch a feeling word to get them to kind of align. So I sort of normalized it. But looking at it this way, I actually feel like I inhabit all of these. Like certain things, like I'm much more of an anger person than a disgust person. But I certainly, I mean, disgust is probably my weakest thing that I have a awareness of feeling. But all the others, I have a deep emotional relationship with those emotions. I guess fear is probably my second weakest.
Yeah, I did as well. First time I saw these, I was like, I have definitely taken on a lot of these roles. And I also want to bring up that entering the room, Notorious LOL brought this up, that we are sensitive to other people's body language and feelings and receptors. And so when I am in that drive role, there's probably someone in fear or in shame. And I need to be receptive of that. So just being aware that these are the other roles that are probably going on with the people I'm working with is kind of eye-opening, right? Like we all want to be joy. Some of us aren't brave to be a 9, to be the bridge between stress and peace, but a lot of us wonder, like we all have these ideas, but maybe we're too fearful to say them during the meeting or say them to the people we love the most. I think it's a really good layout.
Yeah, one of the fascinating insights for me, and again, I don't know how robust this is but that joy is connected with disconnection from self, which actually makes sense in the sense that there's a sort of ecstatic, out-of-body, transcendent feeling to it. But it's also why, if you use the word pleasure, you know, it's kind of, that's where addictions live. That's where, and that's why like the sanguine personality type, what people talk about is the person who never learns anything. They're a walking disaster, but they're enjoying it because they're late and they're disorganized, is they're kind of disconnected from the growth of self. And that makes me think about joy as not really the goal. Like in this framing, at least, again, I don't know how robust this is that all of these things are useful, but none of them are the goal. In fact, one could argue, and I guess I would argue, though I haven't formalized it really well, is that the highest state of being human is in fact transcending, individuating, and connecting to get to this place of Christing, which I'm sort of not really defining with any great rigor, but it's kind of that thing which reconciles those tensions.
Sorry, just to hear that word Christing just makes me laugh.
So technically that would mean I'm bursting your frame of reference.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, and that is a form of Christing.
Oh.
Pulling in the tension and releasing it. Laughter is it is you know, it can be either you know, laughing and crying both inhabit that 9 space in some odd ways. In fact, that's one of my disciplines, is that when something strikes me as off or uncomfortable, I make a point of laughing rather than yelling or complaining. And I've discovered that people tend to take it much better. Not always. Some people get offended that I laugh about something that's supposed to be serious, but when I can get away with it, it definitely makes me much easier to be around.
And I'm
It's
really
doing the
sorry.
joy. It's doing the joy trick to disconnect from myself.
I'm really sorry to keep picking holes, but did you mean to have 2 4s and not a 5?
Oops. Good catch.
You're now muted. You're still muted, Ernie.
Yeah, confusion and disagreement are the most valuable things you can bring, because this is both simultaneously trying to help me think more clearly and help me communicate. And this was purely a communication glitch of forgetting to, when I cut and paste things, forgot to change that to a 5. So thank you.
Heaven forbid you made a mistake.
I threw that one in there just so you wouldn't think I'm too perfect.
Yeah.
Not usually a problem.
So also, did you intend that the corner opposites are external and the side and up and down opposites are internal?
No, that's an interesting observation. I chose the 4 here. I mean, I'm not sure why the corner, because it's a grid, right? You could rotate it 45 degrees and it would be just the same thing. It just kind of worked out that way. I don't know why, but if there's some hidden patterns in there that you find significant, that's cool.
Well, you tend to be angry often. Anger is expressed towards someone else. You can be angry at yourself, but for the second. And the person that you're angry at then tends to be fearful. So it's a relational thing, whereas drive tends to be an internal thing, and wonder is a state of internal situation. The same with grief and joy, it tends to be more internal, whereas you are disgusted with someone else, and then they feel shame as a result of your disgust.
That's cool.
Actually, the classic definition of depression is anger at yourself.
I know, but
it's sort of the mirror image of anger, right?
Yeah.
It's yeah. Yeah, it's cool. The reason I used a grid rather than a circle was primarily because of the limitations of my graphic design skills, but it is also easier to read. And so if there are some interesting insights one can draw from it, so much the better. I want to do some sort of color coding at some point. But
I keep thinking about when 2 people are in a similar role, so like 2 people both in anger interact. And I think about how many times that's happened to me, like 2 people both grieving or 2 people both in shame. But the 2 people in anger, I see that a lot.
What's interesting
lately.
Yeah, what's interesting, my therapist talks about triangulation, whereas you bond by saying, hey, let's both be angry at this person over there. That is one of the strongest ways to bond quickly, is by having a common enemy. And sometimes it can be anger. Disgust works the same way, is by focusing on an external one. And, to a lesser extent, you can do that with fear or joy. Or actually any of these things, I suppose. Some are easier to pathologize perhaps than others.
I think the triangulation can be done with every one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you share joy, and people with drive sometimes get together.
Yeah.
And they get disgusted with the other person who's not.
Yeah.
That's definitely me. I am driven like nobody's business, and I have PTSD, and I'm not supposed to be driven. I'm supposed to be depressed, can't get out of bed. I can't do this for the rest of my life. I got things to do.
All right, let's just wrap up by jumping to the last slide. And so this is the idea of wisdom, and I'm just sort of defining this word spiritual maturity as the thing which enables us to hold tension long enough to find the right role, also the process of doing it and the result of doing it. And the metric is a successful role is one that resolves everyone's tension, not just my own. Pause for likes, notices, and wonders.
Why spiritual maturity, not just maturity?
Because physical maturity is definitely something different. Emotional maturity may not be.
I guess I was thinking of it as emotional maturity because
Yeah.
it's not spiritual. It's not necessarily spiritual in terms of people could not be spiritually mature but be very emotionally mature and have these same skills.
I don't know. I think from my mind, like I said, I'm defining spiritual maturity as this thing. And the thing that is stronger than emotional maturity is that I literally mean everyone. Like, it's easy to be emotionally mature in a small circle. But to me, maximum spiritual maturity is where you literally are caring about everyone on the planet, past, present, and future, and possibly all the non-living things, all of the living things and non-living things. That is the maximum peak of spiritual maturity, which is pretty close to maybe not acting like God, but feeling like God. And that's a bit of a stronger statement than mere emotional maturity.
So you're defining, okay, so for me, spiritual maturity is, let me see, recognizing who I am in relation to a divine, AKA our Father. Savior complex? Spiritual maturity is, for me, being able to, oh, okay, I'm gonna back out of that. I just feel like is the enabler, process, and result. I gotta think about that. I'm sorry.
No, I think we were really
That was a good thought.
Yeah, it's like rationalizing who you are and how far you're willing to be flexible for other people. Like, how much self-sacrificing are we going to do because someone is pushing us a direction we don't want to go? I don't know. I think spiritual maturity is it, because like we owe ourselves to be our best self, but we also owe it to the people in our lives to be who they need us to be. It's a
precisely the tension between connecting and individuating, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's interesting because I was thinking of spiritual maturity as the individual. What is your relationship to God? How do you feel about that relationship? I really, spiritual maturity for me is a big deal. Because when I first got saved, oh, please, not even remotely mature. But these days, I think experience has made me mature. So, keeping my nose in the word, talking to people of like-minded or not so like-minded, but at least talking things through, de-escalating in a way that leaves everyone still intact emotionally, spiritually, and otherwise. I mean, I really feel like spiritual maturity is necessary, and it's good for the whole, not just for the part.
I'm with you, Emiliana. I tend to think of spiritual maturity as just me and God.
Mhm.
And I think it's kind of profound to also think of it in the context of our community and the body of believers, both local and at large. I'm gonna have to ponder that a bit. I've never really framed it that way before.
And what's interesting, the thing that I love about this deck in particular is that I'm trying to define this as an objective problem statement, right? Without any reliance on any particular religious tradition. Now, I happen to think that encountering Jesus through the cross is the ultimate way to achieve spiritual maturity. But I also think that there's lots of other traditions, and that like I'm a universalist around Jesus being the best way, but I have far more modest expectations of Christianity as a historical tradition. And so I think the Christian tradition is useful for certain things, as is Buddhism, as is Stoicism, as is the psychological tradition. They each have different strengths and weaknesses. And my proposal is basically evaluate all of them against this rubric for how good are they at helping us do this thing. And
Are you trying to create a rubric?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and if I have to, the name of the discipline, which I came up with a while ago in case I need a name for it, not that any of you have asked, is Zoasophy, which is, so philosophy is the love of wisdom. Zoasophy is the living of wisdom. So Zoa as in Zoe, life,
Yeah.
zoology, Zoasophy. And it is interesting to me that there is no discipline devoted to living well. They're devoted to different solutions to the problem, but not to actually owning the problem. So I guess without realizing it, that is what this call is the kickoff of the Zoasophy project. And this is draft one of what I think it is, living well or being human.
Could you repeat that thing about there's no discipline what?
There's no discipline that I know of that owns the problem of living well. There are disciplines devoted to specific solutions. So psychologists are devoted to a specific set of solutions for how to live well. No psychologist will talk to you, very few will talk to you about nutrition. Very few of them will talk to you about spirituality, right? If you're a psychologist, you have a certain set of things you do. And if your problem, and this has been, I love my current therapist because he was the first one to admit that most psychologists don't know what they're doing. They have a toolbox of solutions. If your problem matches one of their solutions, you're good. And if not, they throw their hands up or try to shove you in their box.
And that's an opinion. Just wanted to make that clear. That's an opinion.
That is his, he is that is his observation based on his years of experience of actually being one.
Right, because I have one of those, and my sense, and he's good God, he's gonna almost 50 years in the biz.
Wow.
My sense is that his is to listen, to stand alongside, and the wholeness. He says that what he does is dynamic. Because it's the whole person. So he addresses all of those things that are affecting the whole person. He's not going to necessarily tell you, well, you need to eat this, this, and this, but he might say, nutrition could be an issue.
Yeah, and what you'll find, people who are very mature in their discipline can break free a lot of the shackles and constraints. What's interesting to me about my relationship with my therapist is that we're at the point where the things that I need from him to move forward are bumping into the edges of what, his understanding of what it means to be a psychologist. And to his credit, he's willing to renegotiate these things with me. And one of the things that is fascinating to me is that by definition, our professions are almost designed to avoid incarnation. Is that there is this arm's length keeping you at a distance so that I'm still able to function in my own life and that I'm not dumping my problems on you. And that is a useful thing about the professional model. It allows people to sustain that, but it's also a limitation. Like what we have in this sort of peer community here is one of the things that I also have enjoyed immensely about the last 18 months is that there is no authority who's expected to have the answers. Is that we're all sort of here for each other and we sort of can, you know, to a greater or lesser extent, move between different roles. And there are certain problems that can be solved in that context, which can't be solved in a professional context. Conversely, one of the things that I'm wrestling with now is I've been spending the last 18 months polishing this DBJ format for sort of reflective devotional. And I've really been confronted with the question, well, actually, maybe there is an educational didactic component to explain some of these concepts so people understand what it is we're trying to do in DBJ. And right now I have no clue how those two fit together. Are they parallel tracks? Are they complementary? Is there a way to merge them together into something that's even more powerful and potent? I have no clue. That's just setting up the problem. And I'm open to thoughts. And we have 5 minutes left, so I will leave it open for anyone to make closing comments, including suggesting questions that they would like us to pursue in the future.
So just to clarify, when you say spiritual maturity, that's spiritual with a small s, because it's not limited to a particular religion, understanding, approach, point of view. So we're not talking about Christian spiritual maturity. It's spiritual in the sense of a holistic, whole person, zoosophy type.
So I'm arrogant enough to say, I think this is what Christ meant and what everybody else who talks about this means. That's my arrogant statement of what I'm talking about.
You said you prefaced it with "I think," so it's not that's not that arrogant. It's okay.
So how does God fit into this process?
That is a great follow-up question.
Because I assume that Jesus would have meant that God was involved in us becoming more spiritually mature somewhere in the process. It wasn't just us on our own learning to live with this tension and then becoming mature.
Yeah, because he does address that by talking about milk versus meat. So I really feel like you should spiritual maturity. I'm sorry, if this is discipling by Jesus, spiritual maturity is capital S because it involves Jesus.
Yeah, but at the moment, none of Ernie's stuff that he's presented today involves Jesus.
So is that the point, Ernie, is not to deal with Jesus? Or
so the point is to frame the question to which I personally believe Jesus is the answer. But in order to make it a fair test, I have to separate the question from the answer.
Uh-huh.
So in that case, it's not a good question, because you can't have spiritual maturity with a capital S for which the only acceptable answer for a Christian is Jesus, and say it's a separate question.
Wait, I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
So Ernie said that he separated the question from the answer. So he believes that Jesus is the answer to this process, but he has framed the process in such a way as it would be unacceptable for a Christian to not have Jesus as the answer. It would be unacceptable for a Christian to conclude at the end of this that Jesus is not the answer to spiritual maturity. So therefore, it's not the right question.
Well, it depends on what you mean by the word Christian. But anyway, so
wait, is there more than one definition of Christian? Am I missing something?
Throughout the centuries, it has been defined in a variety of different ways. Like for 1,000 years, it was someone who took communion within the church from an approved priest. So there's different definitions. And as we've had some minor conflicts here and there over which definition is appropriate, as you may have noticed.
Minor.
So anyway, but the point is that I think there's a whole, the point of this was to try and come up with a coherent question and a series of definitions. And I have not thought much about the questions Kate is raising. Delighted to have those conversations going forward. We're low on time. I'm just going to capture the question and see if anyone else has any final thoughts they'd like to share, any likes, wonders, or notices.
I have a
I-
like, wonder, or notice.
Hey, Janet.
I have something. Hi, guys. Nice to be here with you. Just in listening to this all, I'm trying to follow it and everything. The only thing that I'm wondering is this is all analytical, which is it's important. It has its place. Is there a plan for moving it out of analyzing where I might be on the grid to where I actually practice it with Bill, or with Emiliana, and is there a way of moving into that process of taking it from the hypothetical, from the analytical into the here and now?
Yeah, that was my same question, actually.
100%.
So I missed the process. I wouldn't say you described a process. You described a grid, then used the funny word rubric. I don't know what to make of that word, but I think the process is what Janet said. We just practice. We to do this 100 times and then you kind of learn. But right now it's missing a formal process. So I wouldn't know how to find the right role.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like I just asserted some definitions of this is what a process, this is what qualifies as a process. But just so we're clear, the whole purpose of this thing was to see if I could convince myself and you that I'm not completely insane, that I actually have a meaningfully valid mental model that is useful. And it sounds like we did pretty good there. So given that, then it's like, okay, now that I know what I think and I have some confidence that it rings true, I can actually think about how to implement it. So that's a wonderful challenge to have moving forward.
Actually, what I'm getting from this is I'm learning more about your process. You're very analytical. I am not. I am more on the emotion side. Because the first few slides, I'm like, oh, my head hurts. Oh, so much analysis, and Janet nailed it. So I just feel like Jesus is just not that analytical.
Well, the Bible says, here's the problem. There's the fall. That's the framing. And then here's the solution to fix it. So even the Bible is not just emotional, right?
Right.
It's highly
But it's
analytical.
not so analytical that it's not so heady that I can't, I gotta,
Yeah, Reading needs more cutesy snake characters and things like that. Yeah.
Well, I can go into a long discussion. So this was trying to come up with sort of a analytic, sort of context-free kind of framing. I'm happy to have follow-on discussions about I have a lot of complicated theories about what happened in the tree of life and so forth.
So I would also argue more examples. So can you point to some real world situations where it's clear that that's due to tension? Or here's one example beyond Jesus of how it was resolved. Because right now I'm trying to fabricate these examples, and it's really hard because I don't necessarily understand what you said. And examples help. The Bible is nothing. 10 million examples of fallen man and Jesus doing a million things. And
Terrible.
So I think Janet proposed that we have a session where she tries to figure out how to use these to apply to you. So we can.
But I don't understand them yet. And I'm just saying, like any complex thing, you need examples.
Yeah.
Need Zoasophy 101.
Good.
Okay, so whatever the opposite of analysis is, I'm the opposite.
Synthesis is technically the opposite of analysis.
There you go.
That's interesting.
Although the opposite of judging is perceiving. So cognitive is affective. So anyway, there are many opposites depending on which grid you're drawing. But so anyway, for me, this was a successful conversation, and that it feels like it validated that there is a there, and there is some interest and hunger in follow-ons that address some of these things, both at a more practical level, but also at a theological level, which I think are all interesting, valid questions. And I will catch up on my sleep. I may set up a chat thread with anyone who's interested. Actually, let me just ask that as the final thing. The easiest way for me to follow up on this would be to set up a chat thread. I think I have emails or phone numbers for all of you. Is everyone interested in being part of that chat thread?
Sure. You're talking about like group me?
Like yeah, group me or iMessage, depending on, I guess if Jenna wants
No,
to be part
not
of it.
iMessage, please, no.
Okay, group me. Okay, group me it is. I'll set up a group me thread and justify my website. Janet, were you interested?
Yeah, I can follow it. I'm still, I'm still not too able to initiate too much at this point. I've probably got another month and a half of recovery and sleep going on and all of that, but I want to stay in touch with you guys, and I love you and I miss you. And, but I am doing better though. Thank you. So as
Okay.
much as I can participate, I'm gonna, keep track of it and be there
This
for it.
is for you, Janet.
As long as you don't mind. Yeah, that's what group me is, that if it's annoying, you can always
Yeah.
mute us and then jump back on later. And someday I'll actually build a digest function for people to get it over email, but not today.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much. It was a delight. This was kind of my, I'm not sure what this is, but it feels like an inflection point. So thank you all very much. And we will talk more later.
All right, good to